My name is Jessica. I work here at TIFF on the Adult Learning team, so it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this event tonight. Before I introduce our guest for this evening, I just have a couple of remarks. So in addition to welcoming you here to TIFF, I'd also just like to recognize the land on which we are gathering is the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. And we're very grateful to be able to work here in this community and come here every day. As a charitable organization as well, there are many people who make our programming possible, so I'd like to give a quick thank you on behalf of TIFF to our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal, Paris, and Visa, and our major public supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. There are also many members and donors who make TIFF's programming possible, so I just want to thank them too, as their support makes a lot of our educational programming and our outreach programming free. The event that you're part of today is part of TIFF's Higher Learning program. And one of the key initiatives of our higher learning program is to be a bridge for those who are maybe studying film and media and want to work in some way, kind of in the industry. So our goal is to organize events that bring together speakers that can share advice and kind of information and knowledge from their own experiences. But we're also kind of creating space and opening up rooms so you can meet each other and kind of drop in and hang out. So if any of these events or sound like something you'd be interested in learning more about, I just encourage you to keep an eye out for higher learning programming. There's some information on the back, at the back of the room. There's postcards, there's a sign-up form. We'll be announcing our summer season soon, and so we hope to have many more events like this one and other formats kind of that I mentioned. So if you are looking to kind of stay connected with TIFF, but also wondering how TIFF might be able to kind of help you out, yeah, please remember us, and we hope to see you again. That's it. Before I introduce our guests, I just want to mention just a bit about tonight and the format of tonight. So we'll chat for the next hour. We will have some time at the end for questions from you. For anyone that needs to be somewhere or pay for your parking, etc., this event will end at 8:30. Right after this event, Sam actually is going to be leaving us and heading over just to Cinema 4. Sam's film, Space Between Stars, is screening as part of our Shortcuts program tonight. So if you're interested in seeing that film and seeing a bunch of other animated short films from around the world, that event is at 8:45, just on this floor. And our Shortcuts program is a year-round program. So in addition to tonight's events, there are kind of monthly screenings of shorts programs. So if you're interested in checking those out, please know that they're here for you. Okay. Now I'm going to introduce our guest, as I've rambled here awkwardly at the microphone. Samuel W. Bradley is an artist and writer based in Toronto. After graduating from Sheridan College's BA in animation, he began his career in the animation industry, where he has worked primarily as a designer and art director on many different television series for over 10 years. Previous to creating and directing Space Between Stars, he was the art director on Just in Time, a Netflix original series created and produced at Guru Studio. He also has a deep love for consuming and creating comics. Aside from making art, he is passionate about traveling the world, baking delicious food, collecting skulls, getting lost inside novels and video games, and befriending dogs wherever and whenever possible, of course. Space Between Stars is his directorial debut. So I'd like to introduce Sam, if everyone can help me in welcoming Sam to this podium. That would be great.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I don't think I've ever heard anyone read my bio out before, so that was exciting to hear. It's nice to see all you guys here. As the first slide says, this is going to be a talk about finding our voices. I was really excited when there was an opportunity offered to come here and give a talk. I've been in this building to see many films and come to many talks myself here, so it's great to have the opportunity to give back. And when there was an opportunity to propose a topic for a talk, I thought this would be great, because it's something that I have been reflecting on a lot lately myself. And I think it's one of those things that is really like a very long and kind of never ending process. Defining who you are as a creative person isn't something that really ends, but it does evolve. And I felt like I was due for an opportunity to revisit that concept based on where I'm at in my career. And I thought that no better way to reflect on that than talk about how I ended up where I am and share that with you guys. And hopefully it'll offer you guys a little bit of perspective. So let's get into it. I think this is the perfect way to start this talk. This is a quote from Miles Davis, and he said, "Man, sometimes it takes you a long time to sound like yourself." And that's like a great quote to come from someone like Miles Davis, who, is responsible largely for what we know as jazz music. He had such a prominent role in creating an indelible piece of culture. And it's interesting to come from him as well, because it wasn't uncommon for people to refer to him as the Picasso of jazz. And I think, everyone knows Picasso is this artist who, when he was very young, probably younger than everyone in this room, he was drawing and painting like a classical master. And then, he became known after that as someone who has spent the majority of his life as a creative trying to find his voice, honestly. And so for someone to refer to a musician that way, and then that person to say something like this, I think it's a really insightful comment on, like I was saying, the long journey of trying to figure out who we are and how we sound. I want to give you guys first, before we delve into the concept, a little bit of context for who I am, because I think that another really important thing that I'm probably going to come back to a lot is the idea that finding your voice and defining who you are is something that is really unique to every person. And so I think if you understand who I am and where I'm coming from, even the things that maybe don't apply directly to you and what you're doing and where you're going, you might be able to unpack the high level stuff and filter it down to a more base concept that you'll be able to use to apply to your own life experience, where you're going, where you want to be. And so I think, if you guys have an understanding of what it is that I do, it'll probably help with that. So as Jessica said, I have a background in animation, largely as an artist and designer. Recently, I've directed a film called Space Between Stars, which, again, you guys know that's going to be playing later this evening if you wanna check it out. And a lot of my work has been done in animation and comics, mostly visual, but the further along I go, the more I find there's a pretty strong bond between the writing work that I do and the visual work that I do. I feel like in my personal work, I actually spend more time writing than I do drawing, even though professionally, in my career, I spend 95% of my time drawing. And I think that both my interest in shifting focus towards narrative and not so much about the craft of picture making has had a pretty big influence on my voice, and I think it's going to reflect in the examples I'll give you as we go along. And so I think that sort of speaks to the last point there, talking about my experiences and how they've influenced my perspective. So like I was saying, just I guess if you keep that in mind as we go along, it'll probably make it a little bit easier for deciding how you can take that information and apply it to what it is you're working through on your own. So let's start at the top. The concept of finding and having a voice. So it's a pretty broad question, right? I think that everyone, it seems like a lot of you guys are fresh grads, or people who are finishing school, or people who in general are at a kind of pivotal point where it is you're trying to define who it is that you are. And I don't think that's something that, as I was saying before, really goes away. You kind of keep asking this question. And so I was asking myself this question in hopes that I could give a definition, and I don't know that there's a very obvious way to break it down, but I think it's an important question to ask. I think it's the most important question to ask at the start, because if you don't know sort of where you're headed with the question you're asking, you're never going to know if you find the right answer, right? I think that's true with most questions that are kind of difficult to solve. And And for me, anyways, it kind of came down to a couple of key tenets: honesty, experience, passion, and style. I think those are kind of the surface level things and the underlying things that people often recognize as the elements that would make up somebody's creative voice. And I think that I like that they're kind of broad because they're not specifically directed at artists, musicians, writers, directors, filmmakers. They're kind of more holistic. They're things that you can apply to all of those at a top level, and then from there be a little bit more particular as you break them apart. I think honesty is, there's a reason why it's first in that list. I think it's kind of the most important thing. I think that honesty with yourself and with your audience is probably the most important key to finding your voice. I think if you're not honest with yourself, you're never going to know what it is you're trying to say, and if you don't know what you're trying to say, people are never going to understand you. And it's hard to be honest with yourself. There's a lot of time spent reflecting on what is true, and by that I mean not necessarily like factually true. There are plenty of amazing fictional stories that have no basis in reality and yet are rooted in truth, right? Truth can be defined by experience or emotion, something that's genuine. Experience is important as well, because it kind of defines how we end up where we are in life. It takes us places, and it tells us things about ourselves that I think we wouldn't otherwise know without having been put in certain situations. Passion is another important thing, and I think that there's maybe a connotation with that word that implies sort of like loudness or intensity, and I don't think that is required. I think it is more something like an internal energy, values that you place on your own work and an intensity which you approach it, and it can outwardly reflect loudly, but it doesn't necessarily need to. I think it more has to do with the investment that you put in your work. And style, I think, is kind of the most common way that people recognize someone having a voice, right? Like a surface level application, which, well, I do think plays a role for sure in finding a voice. It's funny how I think oftentimes that is the thing most often pointed to in terms of a particular creator's voice, and oftentimes is the least important part of that. We can talk more about that as we get into it, but I think it's important to keep that in mind, because if you take time to reflect on the surface level things, usually they're indicative of something which has informed them to clarify or dig deeper in terms of those three previous statements: honesty, experience, and passion. I think all of those kind of come first and almost are required to have like a clear sense of visual style, or not even necessarily visual, just style in general. I think the idea of a voice is, like the next point says, an outward expression or representation of yourself. The idea of having a voice kind of dictates that there's like a form of communication or a dialogue that's happening, right? So for someone to want or to have a voice, you need to be using that to express something. And I don't know that it needs to be with someone else. You can have a voice that is internal, but there needs to be a form of communication for sure. And that's, I think, something else worth keeping in mind. There's something that's meant to be said, and whatever you want to say, I think is going to be reflected through your experiences, but the way that you express it is going to have a big impact on how people, including yourself, internalize it, right? How they unpack it and how they feel about it when it's communicated, which is like, I don't know, a good example of that would be like a cover song, right? You could have 5 different musicians play the same song, and you could interpret them completely differently. You probably would, even though the origin or the intent of it started in a very similar spot. And I think it's finally like an internal measure of truth, which is relating back to the idea of honesty, right? I think that for the people you look at and you feel that they have a very distinct voice and style, usually they're being true to themselves first, and from there it is much easier to be true to an audience. All of this kind of comes back to the idea of communication. Like I was saying, if you're building and working on developing a voice, you're doing so for the sake of communicating ideas, feelings, emotions, stories, concepts, things that are fundamental to being human. Like I think a big part of who we are as people, as a collective, is really defined by the way that we interact with one another, and that is defined by our individual voices. Um, and the idea of language is something to keep in mind as well. That second to last bullet point there, language versus feeling, I think is a really interesting thing. A lot of the times we're going to have ideas or concepts or emotions, things that we want to express in a really particular way that we understand very clearly ourselves, things that are inside of us. And language is very often going to be the tool which we use to communicate that. And this conversation about having a voice really is dictated by the idea of language. And yet it is extremely difficult at times to express the things that are inside you in a concise and accurate way. You can have a very specific feeling about something and explain it to someone, and they can feel like they completely understand what it is that you're saying. And both parties might be completely on the same page about that, and yet how you're feeling inside can be completely different. And that's, I feel like for me, a really interesting thought. And that's, I guess, what I mean by articulation versus accuracy, right? Like you can articulate things in a really particular way that makes sense for you, in a way that you understand, that is reflective of your life experience, your style, your voice, and someone else may accurately interpret that or not. And I think that is like one of the biggest challenges of finding a voice, is not just saying things that are important, that ring true to you and that have value, but then also finding a way to communicate that in a way that people are going to interpret the way that you hope they will, which I think is kind of where art comes in. The emotional component to narrative and storytelling and having a voice oftentimes depends on communicating ideas in a way that are going to resonate with people who are there to consume the things that you're creating, sharing, and expressing. And finally, it's how we differentiate ourselves, right? Like everyone's voices are different, and I think the reason why, if you guys are interested in the topic of finding your voice, it is because you want to stand out. You want to find a way to express yourself in a way that is different than everyone else, and probably more importantly, you're driven to do that from things that inside you that you feel need to be said in a way that no one has been able to say before. It's, I think, easy for everyone to say a lot of the same things, and for us to communicate in a way that is like surface level and satisfying, but it's quite challenging to express yourself in a way that is unique to who you are as a human being. And I think one of the most exciting things about finding your voice. I want to talk a little bit about knowing yourself. I think to return back to the idea of honesty from the top notes there, knowing yourself is kind of like the basis for that. If you understand who you are as a person, it's going to allow you a lot more creative freedom and a lot more freedom of expression. I think everyone's creative voices are quite a bit different from one another, and it's easy to get a little bit comfortable expressing yourself in a safe way. I know that that's something that I am guilty of at times, but I think it's kind of exciting to push yourself outside of the confines that we're used to in terms of familiar subject matter and content and feeling, to try and find things that are a little bit uncomfortable or unnatural or unfamiliar, things that are going to make you a little bit hesitant to explore. And self-reflection is a big part of that. It's taking time for yourself to understand what's inside you, what it is you're looking to say, and how you can say those things in a way that is unique to your personal voice and unique to your personal experience. I think the easiest way for me to wrap my head around how I've done this are through four sort of key pillars: my tastes, my skills, my affinities, and my experiences. And I'm going to talk through all four of those. I'm going to show you guys some examples of each of those in terms of my own work. And I think this is kind of what I was talking about at the start, where it'll offer you guys an opportunity to see how I've applied those experiences to my career and personal growth as an artist. And then from there, hopefully you guys can take that, unravel it a little bit, and consider how you could apply those things to your own creative tastes or visions. So your tastes, we'll start there, because I feel like this is probably the earliest stage of development for finding your voice. Your tastes oftentimes, or at least for me, came at a very young age. there are the things that are defined, by your parents when you're young, maybe from your siblings, your best friends, your kindergarten class, your early teachers. The things that really embed themselves deeply, sort of like in your psyche, that I think over time get buried and lost, but don't ever really go away. I think when we're young, the way we interpret information is like it's a lot more plastic and sticky than it is when we're older. And I don't think I really understood this very well until I was talking to someone about the concept of like how people perceive time, and it was a really interesting thing. I don't know if there's any truth to this, but it makes a lot of sense. Somebody was telling me that the reason why when you're younger it seems like time moves so much slower than it does when you're older is because we use experiences that we have in our life as bookmarks for periods of time that have passed. So, for example, like this film that I mentioned that I made, I finished that last year, and that was like a big milestone in my life that happened around this time last year. And then I took a couple trips last year as well. I went to a couple festivals and I traveled a little bit, and those were a couple other big milestones in my life last year. And then between there, it was kind of just like status quo for me. I was making a lot of art, which was good, and I was recovering from the film, getting some rest. But the time went by very, very quickly. And when you're young, kind of every experience you're having for the first time, right? So for me, releasing a film was it was my directorial debut. It was my first film, first time going to festivals. All these things were new to me, and they were the first time I got to do it. But getting up out of bed in the morning, going for a swim, going for a walk, going to work, getting lunch, all those things are things that I've done on a regular basis, time and time again, and they kind of turn into a blur. But when you're young, yeah, you're a lot more elastic, and the things that you're experiencing, since they're so new to you, they embed themselves in your brain in a much more permanent way. And I don't know, I think that's a really interesting idea, the idea that like your first time experiencing everything has this really strong impact on how you perceive time, right? And because of that, those things get stuck in your head as well. Like I feel like those landmarks that I continue to have, even though they're further spaced out, they do sort of impact my work and my creative process pretty significantly. And so when you're young, you're having these happen all the time, and whether you like it or not, they're embedding themselves in you, they're becoming part of who you are, and they're defining your personality. And I think on a really subconscious level, they do have a big impact on the things that you work on later in life, the creative choices you make, the person you become. And again, this comes back to the idea of self-reflection, right? Those things are in there so deep that I think a lot of the times, at least for me, I'm not often aware of them. It's really interesting when something surfaces and there is like a clear connection about where it came from or how it got there, because most of the time I just feel like, oh, I like the color red or I like spaceships, but there is no like direct throughput until something connects. There are some dots that light up, and I remembered an experience I had when I was very young, and I was like, oh, of course, that's where that thing came from. I guess that's what I mean by the point that says they evolve and dissolve over time, which is like, again, this kind of abstract idea that we put these things inside of ourselves and we forget about them, and they, dissolve into other bits of ourselves, but I don't think they ever really do go away, right? They kind of synthesize into new ideas, new concepts, and sometimes broader, sometimes deeper, sometimes even more surface level ideas, but they become a part of who we are. I want to show you guys some of my early tastes so you can get a sense of that, and I think it'll be interesting to see how those filter through later things that I've created. So I'm going to start with some animated work because this is what I do. So I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with this stuff, but it's Miyazaki's work. There's Triplets of Belleville is up there, Totoro, Samurai Jack, Snow White, 101 Dalmatians, and there's even some Spider-Verse down there in the bottom right. I guess not so much early life with that one, but even though that is a very recent thing, it has had a pretty big impact on me creatively. These are all things when I saw them, I had a really strong emotional reaction to all these. Akira in the middle, things that like I still think back on. They pop out of my head when I'm in a completely different place. I will drift and my mind will go blank, and I have those moments of clarity, and these things are in there. They're like ingredients that have become a part of me. Some live action films that are a big part of my creative upbringing, I guess. These are things that either I discovered on my own or I was introduced to by people whose tastes I really respect. Coincidentally, I just saw Virgin Suicides play here not too long ago. I saw Aliens play here about a year ago. It's actually like a strange creative circle that this talk has brought me to. This slide was from a presentation I gave like 2 years ago. So I had, after making this slide, come to this theater and saw Virgin Suicides, and I'd seen Alien play also at this theater after that. And because of the work that I made based on these inspirations, I made a movie which brought me back here to give a talk. So it's this weird circular kind of motion of like art influencing art, influencing artists, influencing art, and yeah, somehow this talk in the theater, we're kind of in the middle of it, which is pretty neat. Some early books as well. I read a lot. I guess like obviously I consume a lot, probably in the same way that a lot of you guys do, and it's also interesting to see how some of these things, like in terms of content, really haven't influenced my work at all. Like some of these things, there is very clear through lines. Like a book like Neuromancer was one of the things that introduced me to science fiction at like an early age, and I think I read Neuromancer before I saw Blade Runner. And for those of you guys who are familiar with my work, obviously the aesthetic of Ridley Scott and Blade Runner has been a big influence on me. But that book I discovered even before that, and was kind of like one of the key pillars for making me more curious about that sort of work. And then other books here, like I said, I think they're embedded in me deeply. I don't know how they've defined me as a creative person, but I do often, again, like that previous slide, find them popping into my head, thinking about them when my mind wanders. And so I know that they're influencing the work I'm making, but I couldn't point to examples of my paintings or my work and say, oh, that's where that came from. It came from A Farewell to Arms or Age of Spiritual Machines. But absolutely, the person I am today has been on some level influenced by that. Same with video games. As Jessica mentioned in the intro, I spent a fair bit of time playing video games as well as books. And something that's interesting about games is they've influenced the animation work I've done a fair bit. And I get really excited when I'm able to draw from different mediums to create the content that I'm making. So I came to animation kind of in a roundabout way. And I didn't have a big background in it. And there were times I remember when I was younger feeling a little bit limited by that, when my friends, had been watching Disney since, before they could talk, and they were familiar with the entire library, and they had this like encyclopedia of like how an animated film is made. I felt kind of at a disadvantage until I started to make my own work, and I was drawing from my own influences. And even though the things I was pulling from might not have been specifically tailored to animation, I feel like they helped me define myself in a slightly different way than most people who were pulling from animation. And not to discredit the work that my friends have done in a more traditional sort of route, but I personally get excited about things that are a little bit fresher and more experimental without necessarily having all of the rough edges sanded off. And I think the time I've spent playing games has had a really positive impact on my work in that regard. The same with comics, actually. So this is a good example. There's some work here from Paul Pope and Sean Tin, and that's Akira there at the end. And the second to last one is a book called Sunny, which is probably the best comic that I've ever read. And I didn't start reading comics until I was quite a bit older. I was like in my mid to late 20s before I really dug into comics. And again, the film that I made recently, the way that I storyboarded it was hugely influenced by the comics that I was reading, as opposed to the storyboards that I had seen from other animated works or the other animated movies that I made. And I don't necessarily want to say that is the better way to do it, but I think that it did lead to some unusual and uncommon decision making that helped differentiate the work that I was making and make it feel more my own, a little bit more unique than like a typical storyboarding process. So I had that list, your tastes. Next were your skills. I think that your skills are a really important part of finding your voice as well. So there are learned experiences. They're the things that we're taught. They're the things that we get, as we're a little bit older, probably, high school, college, people teaching us things more along the lines of formal training is what I mean by this. And I think it's great to study and learn from the people who have come before us, especially in creative fields. In the past, there's been like kind of a storied history of mentorship that I honestly wish was a little bit more prevalent now than it was in the past. I think that learning in particular from other people who are who have like a formidable career in your craft, I think is one of the best ways to really advance your skills. And it's sometimes hard to find those people. So when you get the opportunity to connect with someone and build that kind of relationship, I would really encourage it. School is good for that as well. Like I went to art school. I graduated from Sheridan, and I studied animation there for a few years, and I learned a lot. But I think I learned more while in college from my peers than I did from the formal education process. A few teachers were exceptions to that, but largely it was from my peers. And I guess like the challenge of like a formal education is sometimes your work does end up being a little bit academic and predictable, which is why I would encourage, if you have the opportunity to learn from other people whose voices resonate with you, or whose styles resonate with you, pursue that if you can. Um, all of that said, though, I do think that there is a lot of benefit of a formal education. Like, I did learn a lot of technical craft-driven skills that I'm able to apply and use sort of like as a foundation, and a set of rules that I can bend and break when I need to or want to express myself and communicate the ideas in particular that I want to express. And they require maintenance, so you kind of have to work at these, right? They're things that like will atrophy over time. They take practice, they take time, but I do think that they're worth maintaining. I want to show you guys some of mine, which is, I think the best example of that is the figure drawing that I do. I've been figure drawing regularly since early in college, so the last 15 years or so of my life I've been figure drawing, and it's something that I do pretty much every week. And there is no direct application to the work that I do every day with the figure drawing that I'm doing. There's like, this stuff doesn't go anywhere other than occasionally on my Instagram. That's kind of it. But it's really interesting to sort of chart the path of my career as well as my creative growth as an artist and compare it to the work that I've done in the figure drawing studio. It's really strange how parallel those two lines would be if I were to graph them. And I don't know. I don't want to say that like my getting better at figure drawing is somehow making all of my other artistic abilities improve as well. But I do think it's a really good representation of how like dedicating yourself to maintaining your skills is something that is going to help you build and maintain routines throughout other areas of your life and sort of like train your brain to grow and improve on a regular basis. So figure drawing for sure isn't for everyone. I have plenty of other friends who we went to school together and we went to figure drawing once a week together, and then school ended and they stopped, and they have also continued to progress in their career. They didn't, stop becoming better artists because they weren't coming to figure drawing with me every week. But I think finding those kind of routines that make sense in your brain in terms of like growing yourself as a creative and also like building fundamental skill sets, whatever they might be, are worth sticking with for sure. I think talking about your affinities is interesting as well. This is similar to your skills, but they're the things that are a little bit more natural. They're the things that like are kind of innate. I think like the idea of being left or right-handed. If you're born with a comfortable ability to draw with your left hand, technically you can train yourself to draw with your right hand, but why would you do that if you already are doing it with your left, And I also find that it's really easy to get comfortable with those things. I think everyone does have one or two affinities at different levels, but I also think like probably everyone in this room has met somebody with an affinity for some skill, something that they seem naturally gifted at. And when you're introduced to them, you're like wowed by that talent, whatever it may be. Maybe they have like a great natural singing voice and they can just belt it out, never did a singing lesson in their life. But I often find that like it's easy to use that as a crutch to rely on those sorts of things. And furthermore, it's like easy to get complacent when you have those things innate in you because it makes it easier. So I would recommend being aware of sort of what your natural affinities are if you feel like you have any of them, and try not to use them as a crutch, but more so as a catapult. Use them kind of as an element that you can build your other work on top of, but you're not stuck relying on, so that if for some reason your singing voice disappeared, you would still be able to continue your pursuit of being a musician, right? But when you have that available to you, your work is that much better. For me, the only thing that I have ever felt like I've had a natural affinity for is color. This is a comic that I painted 7 or 8 years ago, and it was like a very moody, emotional thing. There wasn't a lot of dialogue, but I had a particular feeling that I was going for throughout the story. I had a really particular emotional arc that I wanted to communicate, and so it was a great opportunity for me to do that, to use some colors as a way to bring the reader through this story and feel certain ways without having to be really particular about communicating those emotions in other ways, but with the intent, like I said, that if I had to strip out all of those colors and make this a purely dialogue-driven story or a compositionally driven story, I probably could have done that. but it worked out really well being aware of that skill set and then using it as a foundation to translate into the rest of the content. And then your experiences, like I said earlier, are a big part of this. The things that kind of like we do outside of our creative processes, not the things that are natural to us or the things we've trained, but just the things we're doing in between, the elements of like being a human being. I think these are kind of underrated, especially for people who are studying. It's very easy to get caught up in the process of working and grinding it out, which is, don't get me wrong, that is important, but at times more important to be a person, especially in the context of finding your voice, because you can have the most well-refined voice in the world, but if you have nothing to say, no one is going to be interested in listening, right? And most of the things that we're interested in communicating come from the experiences we have outside of the studio, outside of our creative processes. So just a couple examples of some recent things in my life that have been kind of unrelated to art. A picture of a train ride I was taking from Kyoto to Tokyo on the Shinkansen, and a picture of me in a sculpture museum in Reykjavik, a recent visit to New York. That train on the bottom left, I spent 100 hours in that train from Vancouver to Toronto a little over a year ago, and that statue in the bottom center there is on top of the Ghibli Museum in Tokyo, and the Tezuka Museum is in the bottom right. So these are things that I guess tangentially are related to art, but were more about growing as a person. I wasn't drawing when I was there. I wasn't painting when I was there. I guess photos, but these are all just like my cell phone. Yeah, and so it's taking these things, right? It's taking our tastes, our skills, our affinities, and our experiences, and kind of melding them all together to figure out how to divine our voice. And so I want to show you an example of how they combine for me. These are two paintings that I made recently. The one on the left was a painting that I literally made that yesterday for this talk. It's the front of this building, and the one on the right I made about a month ago. And this is kind of like a culmination of all of those things, right? It's like my affinity for color, my travel. I love big cities. It's something that I'm constantly drawn to, which is why there's pictures of me in Tokyo and taking a train from Vancouver to Toronto. I'm into like very industrial looking things. And that comic, it was like this sort of lonely landscape, and these paintings also are like very lonely landscapes. And when I'm making these images, I'm not sitting down and saying, okay, how do I take little bits of each of those things and combine them together? But it naturally finds a way out into my work, right? Which is really interesting. And so that's what I mean about you guys being able to like unpack that and see if there's a way to apply it to your own work, or even just recognizing it in your own work, because it took a long time for me to be able to see that those experiences I had and those skills that I had were combining to let me make the things that I make. After you become familiar with your voice, or recognize it even, it's really important to be able to continue growing. Observation is such an important skill, regardless of your creative discipline or who you are as a person. And I think the reason for that is because if you want to express yourself, you need to see how other people are expressing themselves and find a way that you can interact, right? Like myself as a visual artist, I see other people's art and I respond to that. It influences my work, and it also kind of articulates what I'm not interested in doing as well, which I think is an important thing, being aware of what works for you, but also what doesn't work for you. There's a note on there that says make habits and routines, and I think that one is more for me than maybe for everyone else in this room. I am a very habitual and routine driven person, and it helps me immensely, but I do know that there are other people who can't function that way, and I think it's actually great, right? When I'm making something like this, I'm able to reflect back on what works for me, and some of these things, kind of like I said, are more holistic, top level things that I think everyone can find a way to apply, and there are other things that are just not going to work for certain people. But if you're a person who's driven by routine, lean into that, because sometimes you just need to make a habit of doing work, right? There are things that seem extremely daunting until you do it every day for a week, and then all of a sudden it is a very easy thing that you can carve out, make time for, and improve slowly but surely. I think goal setting is great for everyone. Have an aim for all of your work. Someone told me that very early. I think I was still in college. I asked a friend how he knew when his paintings were done, because I wanted to be able to paint. It was something that I had sort of aspired to for a long time in art school, and I was really bad at it for a long time. And a big part of that was I was often overworking the things that I was doing and not knowing when to stop. And the friend that I asked, who was an exceptional painter, said that before he started, the one thing that he knew was the goal he had for the piece of art he was making. And all of a sudden, everything kind of clicked into place for me. And I was like, okay, if I know what it is that I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to communicate. As soon as I've made something that has achieved that goal, the piece is done, regardless of like refinement or polish, level of articulation. Kind of none of that really matters for me, anyways. And so goal setting is a big part of that for me with all of my work. Taking breaks is super important. Like I said, have life experiences. This is a thing that, like, again, this is in here as much or more for myself as for you guys. I just spent 2 years making a film, and the last 6 months finally I've been able to like unwind a little bit, and it has taken me nearly a year to get back to a point where I'm ready to like jump back in and start building a new giant exciting thing. And I don't think I would be at that point if I hadn't given myself some time to breathe. And so this is for Sam of 2 years from now, after I've made another giant project and I really need to chill out again. I need to take some breaks and avoid burning myself out. um, Sort of relating back to the skill set thing earlier, you need to maintain your skills, right, and maintain your voice. I think the singer thing from earlier is a good analogy for that, right? It's something that you have to work at and take care of, to keep it healthy. It's not something that will be waiting for you if you leave it behind for a year or two or five. And I think that's part of why I like routines. There are things that I do which, I'm not sitting down with a sketchbook or in front of some kind of writing software or in front of Photoshop and saying, okay, I'm refining my voice. I'm just being a creative person. But making a habit of that is doing it in the background. I might sit down and paint for an hour, and it's good or bad, it gets thrown away or it gets put in a frame. It doesn't really matter. It's still something that's helping to, define who I am on a subconscious level, even though that is never like a thing in the forefront of my brain. Everyone has heard the 10,000 hour thing. If you guys have heard me talk before, I think it's a lie, because 10,000 hours isn't nearly enough. I wish 10,000 hours was enough, but like, I've drawn for way more than 10,000 hours, and all I see are further landmarks down the road. It is not enough. Probably the hardest thing to do on this list is not thinking about it too much. I was so hung up on the idea of like having a voice and a style when I was younger, so hung up on it. And it wasn't until I was much older and much further removed and kind of gave up trying and caring about it that I was able to like recognize that in myself. It's the don't think about the elephant thing, right? The more you want it, the harder it is to find it and recognize that maybe you already have it. And yeah, always the student. Just keep learning. The journey is the journey, right? I want to show you guys some examples of some of the studies that I've done and how studying and learning has influenced who I am as an artist. So these were painted, I think, right after college. The two on the left, they're Frazetta paintings. So the one on the leftmost was originally painted by Frazetta. The one on the right was a study that I made of that, and then the ones on the right, the same thing with Leyendecker paintings. These are two of my favorite artists, and so the one on the left is the Leyendecker and the one on the right are mine. And really, these were like super academic, right? Like, I was looking at their work and literally trying to copy as close as I could, brushstroke for brushstroke. And it's really interesting to do something like this because it puts you in the headspace of another creative. Since these, I have never done a direct master copy again, but I've learned so much from these, and I still find that there are a few little odds and ends and cheats and tweaks that I discovered while making these paintings that I would never have discovered just from looking at the art. And then a few years after that, I wanted to do the same process with a Mobius piece, who is also one of my biggest influences, except at this point I'd kind of started to recognize my style, my art, what I was interested in doing. And at that time I was into the like really clean, slick digital thing that you guys have seen in my other paintings that I was showing before. And I wanted to see if I could translate this Mobius piece on the left into something that like maintained very closely the idea of his art and the design, the composition, but with sort of like a veneer of Sam on top of it, right? And so that's what's happening here. It's kind of like an in-between phase where clearly this is just a Mobius study, but I don't know, it's like the cover song I was talking about before, right? Like, this is my cover song of a Mobius song. And then finally, here's something very recent, which is like kind of the current phase of this evolution, right? This is a picture on the left that a friend took of me on the black sand beaches on the south coast of Iceland past October. And then on the right is a color key I painted for a new project that I'm working on. It's this kind of fantasy adventure. And I mean, if you look at those, there is some direct inspiration. That little cliff face off in the distance floating in the water is in both the photo and in my painting. But really what I'm trying to do is capture the tone and the emotion and the feeling of this place, the memories I've had of that, the emotions, not just from the picture itself, but from the trip, translated into my art. And I think it's a good example from the very direct academic copies to something that was more of like an in-between phase to something like this, where it is really just, it's an emotional transfer, maintaining an intent and a feel, but kind of abandoning the like literal structural approach of the copying phase. Um, Putting distance between yourself and your work is really important. It takes a long time to do that, and requires patience. But if you guys are, for those of you in here who are artists, animators, if you have old sketchbooks, go back and look at something that you drew like 10 years ago, and it will blow your mind. I keep all my old terrible sketchbooks. I love going back and looking at my awful drawings because it's the best way to see that I've improved as an artist. I can look at a drawing I did last week or last month and be like, oh, I've been drawing or painting the same thing for the past year. What am I doing? But if I go back and look at something I did 5 years ago, all of a sudden I'm like, okay, I'm actually growing as a person. So as much as you can, give yourself some distance to recognize those things. I think experimenting and exploring are great, but failing is more important. I think it's really important that you fail. It sucks to fail. It hurts. But if you're not doing things that are causing you to fail, then I don't think you're pushing yourself hard enough. And I think if you genuinely want to find your voice and say something authentic, you need to take some chances. You need to put yourself out there. That is kind of like the essence of having a voice and having something unique to say, is putting yourself out there, right? Making yourself vulnerable. And if you're genuinely making yourself vulnerable, you're gonna fall flat on your face sometimes. And so if you're not doing that, try harder. Like I have failed in things recently in life, and yeah, it hurts, but I look back on those experiences and I have learned way more from them than I have from the things that have, gone exactly according to plan, as nice as that is at times. I think it's important to listen to what's inside you, both your internal monologue, but also sort of your subconscious if you can. If you can take things from inside your brain, your dreams, the random ideas that pop into your head, and catalog those and reuse them, they're kind of like a more pure version of your internal voice. Sort of what I was saying before, these things that get buried inside your brain under layers and layers and layers of years and experiences and ideas. When those things resurface, hold on to them tight if you can. For me anyways, it's a very rare thing that they come to the surface, and I love when that happens. I store them away in a folder in my Google Drive that is like one of my most valuable possessions. Yeah, and I think giving yourself new experiences kind of relates back to what I was saying about taking time away from your work. That is a point that I've come back to multiple times in this, only because I feel like it's really, really worth emphasizing. I want to talk a little bit about ideas coming out of your subconscious. So there was a time, these were painted 3 or 4 years ago, and I was making them after having come off of a very big project. I was painting one or two of these a day, just like I'd spend an hour or two before bed, and they were like, just to please myself, I wanted to make an image, not think about it, and have something done, as opposed to, spending months and months. I just finished art directing a show that had taken 14 months, and it was like consumed my life the whole time. And it wasn't until the very end of that I felt any sense of closure. And the idea of like sitting down and making something and being done with it for myself was very appealing. And I thought that's all those images were until I uploaded one of them to the one on the left. I uploaded it to my Facebook, and I said, hey friends, I'm starting a new Instagram account. I'm making these paintings. If anybody wants to come and follow along what I'm making, check it out. And Facebook's auto face recognition algorithm tagged someone when I uploaded that picture, and they were like, do you want to tag so-and-so in this picture? And I was like, oh my God, I've been thinking about that person so much and had no intent of making a painting of them. I wasn't thinking about them when I was drawing it. It was just somebody who had been like drifting around because of something that had happened a couple of weeks before that. And soon as it tagged them, I was like, oh my God, it looks exactly like that person. Like, how was I sitting there painting at my computer thinking, oh, I'm just doing these things to please myself and they mean nothing. And then I upload it to Facebook, and an algorithm is like, hey, you painted that person you haven't been letting yourself know you're thinking of. It's crazy how these things happen, right? And like, had Facebook not told me that, I maybe still would not know. These would just be lost on my Instagram forever. But I think it's a great story how, these things, whether we know it or not, exist deep inside us. And it's weird and creepy that somehow Facebook saw it before I did, but that's I swear that happened. Why is this important? I think that like it's as important as you want it to be, really. I think that having a distinct voice is something that like as artists, individuals, creatives, we do put a lot of emphasis on because it is how we brand ourselves. It's how we expose ourselves to the world. And like I said, it's how we be vulnerable and put ourselves out there. And I do think that there's a lot of value in that. But I also feel like it's something that you need to take, like everything else, sort of in stride. I don't think it's worth trying to force it. And in my experience anyways, it's actually a really bad idea to try and force it. The harder you push at it, the more it's going to push back and the less progress you're going to make. It's tough because you see people who have really, really distinct styles and voices, and it seems like maybe it comes easier to them, it came younger for them, you struggle with it more, it's harder, you don't know how to do it. But I think if it is genuinely important to you as an individual and as a creator, you need to give yourself a little bit of breathing room and just let it happen naturally as much as you possibly can. One of the things that's important is after you've sort of like started to recognize your voice, you have to decide what you want to say, right? Like I think a lot of the people who you look at whose work has a very recognizable style, not only have they found their voice, but they're saying something with it. Like I can't personally think of an artist or a creative person who has defined themselves with a really unique aesthetic or sound or look, and then they are not communicating something very particular and intent with that approach, right? And it kind of goes back to setting goals. If you don't know where you're going, then you're never going to know if you've arrived there, right? You might have that voice already and not even be aware of it because you don't have the goal of what it is you're going to try and communicate when you find it. That Alan Watts quote is great, right? Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. I don't know if you guys are fans of Alan Watts, but if you're into this talk at all, if you're into this kind of thing about like considering who you are and how you function as a creative and as like an individual, I would recommend listening to some of his lectures because it helps any time for me that I'm able to get some fresh perspective on how I look at the world and how I look at my art. And yeah, it's a great quote, and it relates back to the idea of not trying to force it. Like, or you can try as much as you want, and it's kind of a futile thing. You just sort of have to let it be. And I guess, yeah, I want to show you guys where I'm at and what I'm trying to say. Because to that point I was speaking to earlier, I do think it's important to have a goal. And so I'm going to show you the trailer for the film that I made, which will give you an idea of sort of what it is that I've spent a good chunk of my time working on and the things that I'm trying to say. Hold on a second here, let me just full screen this. Cool. So yeah, that's the trailer for the film that it's going to play later tonight if you guys are interested in checking it out. But I do think now that I've had a year out from making this project, I'm finally, for the first time being able to have that experience where, how like you're walking down the street and you see your reflection and you don't know it's you, and you have a visceral response to that, and then like half a second later you're like, oh my god, I just responded to myself, and you didn't know it was you. I'm finally starting to have that with the film, right? I'm able to look at it, and for the first time, like not completely, I still have a long ways to go, but I'm starting to taste it, and it's exciting because I can see those past ingredients, right? Like I can see inspiration from the comics that I was thinking about, the music that I was listening to, the feelings that I was having, and honestly, a lot of the life experiences I was going through while I was making the film, things that were existing in my subconscious in the same way that painting Facebook algorithm thing happened. I'm starting to see that in the film. If Facebook could watch my movie, it would have a lot to say about it, I'm sure. It would psychoanalyze me like crazy. And I'm finally sort of getting to a point where I'm able to recognize that for myself, and it's a really exciting thing. So that's kind of where I want to end it on this little idea that, like finding your voice is a very important thing. I think it's important to be genuine and passionate and mindful, staying curious and trusting your heart. if you appreciate and share the beauty you find in that, you will absolutely find your voice in time. So that's the talk that I wanted to give, and yeah, sure.
Hello. Hello? Yeah. Thank you, Sam.
My
Are these
pleasure.
on?
Can you guys hear me? Perfect.
It's a small room. I don't know if we really need them, but we'll use them. I hope people have questions. We're going to turn it over in just kind of a brief moment. I do have a question to get us started.
Great. Yeah.
Just wondering, you've worked in for Guru Studio before, so I'm curious, when you are working on other people's projects and maybe helping to execute someone else's vision and voice, is that helpful in some ways in figuring out your own kind of artistic voice, or how do you kind of navigate that as also a practicing artist?
Yeah, there's sort of two different facets to that. The first part of it is it's really interesting to watch other people explore their voice and try and communicate specific things in a way that lets you have fun in their sandbox without necessarily needing to commit to it the way that they do. Having art directed a couple of shows, it's really exciting because I've gotten to have a pretty big hand in the visual aesthetic of a couple hundred episodes of television, which is a great and exciting thing. But conceptually, those belong to someone else, and so it's a fun but challenging thing to try and put yourself in someone else's head and say, okay, you made this thing and you want it to feel a certain way, and now I need to try and understand that and feel the way you feel so that I can articulate it in a visual way that an audience will be receptive to it in the way that you're hoping they will, and the way that you feel inside. It comes back to that idea of what's inside you versus what you say that I was talking about during the presentation, which is a surprisingly tricky thing. And I think the second half of that is that working in television and in animation on other people's projects has given me the opportunity to really just refine my skill set, and I've been doing this for a little over 10 years now, and just, day in, day out, drawing and painting every single day is like building up those muscles, really working those things out so that when I had the opportunity to start expressing myself and making my own projects, I was kind of ready to go. I had spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I just had a lot of practice. So I was like, right out the gate, ready to jump on it.
Do you find, I'm assuming this might be an obvious question, but similarities in terms of values when you're talking about, or people you often work with, or a lot of your collaborators? I know some are in this room, but I'm curious to know how understanding your own voice maybe helps you choose the people you want to work with or the projects on which you want to work.
Yeah, it's a really wide range. When I'm working like strictly professionally in a studio environment, it is a rare opportunity that I get to make those decisions. Usually that comes from production or management side of things. And so a big part, especially with my experience art directing and supervising departments, is building relationships with people whose creative visions don't necessarily match up with mine. Like, I'm pretty voracious and demanding when it comes to the kind of work I want to make. And at the same time, I do my absolute best to be respectful when I'm working with people who they just have a job, right? There are plenty of people who work in creative fields who, it is just a job to them, and I don't say that like as a pejorative. Work is great, and having a life outside of work is great. It is something, like I said, I'm trying to be better at myself. But it's hard when your values don't necessarily align. I think I spend more time being a manager of expectations and realities than I do an art director sometimes, which is an interesting problem to solve. But there have been exceptions to that as well. Like when I was making my film, I did have the opportunity to choose some of the team that worked on it, and most of the key people, actually, I had a pretty big say in who I wanted to work with, and thankfully I got to work with some of the people who I had either worked with before or had been very familiar with their work, and I'm very grateful for that, because collaboration is the reason I work in animation. I think if it weren't for collaborating, I would have very little interest in continuing to work in the field of animation, and so getting to collaborate not only on cool projects, but with great people, there really isn't a better scenario for me in terms of working in a group project.
Collaboration and communication is key, even when you're kind of working to communicate an
Yeah.
idea, I guess. It's huge. Any questions from the audience? I have some more, but yeah.
How do you go about choosing a project, like a personal project?
Oh, that's a great question. So I feel like at this point, it's weird, but I have more projects sort of like in various states in my brain and in Google Documents and sketchbooks than I will ever be able to execute in my entire life. So kind of what I'm doing now that I'm at that point is I'm trying to pursue the ones that make the most sense in terms of what is available to me, as well as the things that are going to satisfy me the most creatively. So the short film that I made, I think, is a really good example of that, where the studio I was working at the time, Guru, I was wrapping up art directing Just in Time, which is the show Jessica mentioned when she introduced me. I think I had like 2 weeks left, and one of the members of the development team mentioned that the studio was considering developing a short film, and it wasn't long after that. I think the next week they announced that they were going to be doing that, and it was an open opportunity for anyone at the studio to pitch an idea. And because I have this sort of like giant back catalog of ideas, I had a few things that I thought might be appropriate to pitch as a short. So it was like a matter of days later, I pitched 2 different ideas, and the reason I had them is because I've just got this big backlog, and then there was an opportunity. Someone once told me that like the whole right place, right time thing works out a lot better for you if you're constantly putting yourself in the right place, because eventually it will be the right time, and that is an example of that, right? Where if you just have those things prepared and ready to go, when the opportunity does arrive, it'll give you an opportunity, sort of a leg up, and you'll be ready for it in a way that probably you don't even realize you're ready for it. So that's kind of a big part of how I go about choosing my projects, and I'm doing that with new things that I'm looking forward to now as well.
How long was space between stars in your head or in your Google Drive?
It was in there for a few months. I guess I'll tell the story because I really like it. I know some people in here have heard it before, and it kind of relates to someone in the room, so I want to tell the story. There were 2 sort of main points of inspiration for the film. One of them was a French graphic novel that I read called Beautiful Darkness, and if any of you guys are interested in comics, I'd highly recommend it. It's published by Drawn and Quarterly. It's a beautiful book. I bought it because of the fact that it was a beautiful book. It's all watercolor and illustrated by this dude called Carrasco. I love French art, and they're masters. And so I picked it up and bought it, having no idea what the story was about. And as I started to read it, I realized it was actually like a really, really dark and creepy story, even though on the surface it looked like this really delicate, beautiful fable. And just the idea of that, something that kind of lures you in and lowers your defenses because it is a beautiful thing, was really appealing to me. And so I kind of tucked that away with no real place for it, but I went into that Google Drive. And then a couple of months later, a friend of mine, it was his birthday, and the night before his birthday, I made a little painting to give to him, and it was like a very off-the-cuff thing. I don't even think I had done like a preparatory sketch. And then I gave it to him the next morning. So from making that painting to giving it away, I had saw it for a matter of hours, and I've still to this day never seen the painting since, and that was a couple of years ago now. But I have a really particular sort of like emotional memory of what that image was. It was this beautiful glowing little sprite thing that was this delicate little creature, and for whatever reason, a few months after that, I was taking a walk, and I just was thinking about that idea of, oh, wouldn't it be cool to do that like beautiful on the surface but creepy underneath sort of story for animation? And then I was like, oh, what if the aesthetic of it was something slightly related to that painting I had made for a friend? And that was sort of the moment where it clicked, and I was like, oh, there is something there, like I have got this sort of design aesthetic that is appealing to me, and I have a story structure that's appealing to me, and I can't think of an animated short film I've seen that has been approached that way. And so that was where the idea was born, and that was it. It was like 1 page in a Google Doc for a couple months, and then there was the opportunity to pitch it, and I took that 1 page and made 1 painting, and that was sort of like the genesis of the film.
Any questions? Yes.
The anthology project,
Mhm.
The Boy in the Moon, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Is that your take of an artist kind of finding his path, building that dock over that lake, kind of attaining this ultimate goal? And I also just want to add, I find it very interesting that the dock zigzags, and do you think that that's the artist kind of getting lost in the craft and forgetting about that goal, only to remind himself of it?
You're very close. So when I started working on that, the theme that my friends and I had chosen for that book was the idea of obsessions, and I find that something that I do, which I think maybe is different than some other artists, is when, like, I guess relative to those paintings that I showed that I thought were just paintings, I do find oftentimes I will start working on something without having sort of like a driving life experience to define that. And it is not until after a project is finished and I look back on it, and at that point I'm able to say, oh, clearly this was inspired by XYZ in my life, even though I didn't realize that thing was in my brain when I was making this thing. Now that it's done, how could I have been so foolish not to see it? And so we had this theme of obsessions, and I was come up with that narrative, and I was like, oh, this fits the theme. I'm looking to do these watercolor paintings. I like the idea of a shifting palette carrying the story through. And then the narrative was there to support that. And then when I reflect back on it, I mean, that story is very, very autobiographical. It's about this little boy who is obsessed with achieving this dream of making it to the moon, which I guess is some kind of symbolism for like creative satisfaction. And he spends his life chasing this thing and leaving a lot of things behind, which are like questionable whether or not he should have left them behind. And the zigzagging duck, it's funny, you know, I'd never considered it until you mentioned that, but I think back on that comic, and the further out he gets from his home and the closer he gets to the moon, sort of the more chaotic everything he is building gets, until at the end, spoilers, sorry guys, it completely gets destroyed. And I do think that is like a really nice analogy for how those things kind of spiral as time goes on. Yeah, it's a nice take. I hadn't thought about it that way, but it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you.
Just go back to the topic that you said, how to find your own voice.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not calling myself as a budding artist, I'm still finding my own voice.
Yeah.
But I still like very struggling with when I learning from the artists that resonates with me so much. Because if I copy too much, I kind of like lose myself, lost myself. But if I don't really learn them and just like do my own work, I still find my some of my techniques are so weak, and some of my color taste is so weak. I still want to find something more from the outside world. So I'm just wondering, how could you balance this inward and outward together and to find yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you should learn absolutely as much as you can from other artists, and I don't think it is wrong to like, especially, you know, you can see it in my presentation, copy the work of other artists and learn from that, as long as you're not like implying that that is something that you have created, you know, as long as you're open more so to yourself than anyone else, but also your audience, that those are, you know, like studies that you're using to learn. I would say absolutely do that as much as possible, because at some point you're gonna want to shed those things. It's funny, but I look back on the artists who were big inspirations to me when I was starting college, the people who I was like, oh, I wish I could draw like those people. And, you know, like I look at my sketchbooks and clearly I was trying to draw like those people. And now, you know, 10 or 15 years later, I kind of don't want to draw like those people anymore, but I have been defined a little bit by the time I spent studying them and being influenced by them, and, you know, like wanting to be like them. I think it's really interesting how other people's ideas can kind of become part of us, especially when you're young. There's sort of like this weird stigma about referencing and taking influence from other artists, but that is really what defines all of our creative tastes, right? Like those influences that I had up there, those images at the start, I'm borrowing from all of those, whether I like it or not. Like my having seen Alien when I was a little bit too young and having nightmares about that movie is like a permanent part of my brain. And I would be lying to everyone in this room, including myself, if I said I wasn't referencing sometimes very specifically the work in that movie, right? Because it's part of me. And so I think we just need to embrace it. And as long as you feel like, you know, you're being true to who you are and you're putting your own spin on it and finding your own way, after having synthesized that, then yeah, it's really not a thing you need to worry about. And I think that the more time you spend doing that, the more clear it'll be to you what is true to you and what is part of you, and what is, yeah, surface level veneer stuff that at that point it's not hard to get rid of that, because you're not going to want to do it anymore. So it'll come naturally. And I would say learn from other people, especially now when you're trying to find your voice.
How much of the final product do you have in mind when you were starting a new painting? And does the idea change throughout the painting sections?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I hear some artists say that kind of two things I hear a lot actually is that they know exactly what an image is going to look like before they start, and also that they're painting the world the way that they see it, and neither of those things are true to me. I think that like I have a pretty good sort of like technical craft-based fundamental background where if I want to paint something accurately, I've just done enough paintings that I know I can do that. But in terms of like actually executing and achieving the feel that I'm looking for, it is like a very wishy-washy, homogeneous, messy inside out, and sometimes quite clear process. Like it's all over the board. And I'm really, really emotionally driven with my work. Like the thing that directs me and gives me that goal that I was talking about 95% of the time is an emotional thing when it is my own art anyways. When it's working on a production for someone else, it's a much different thing. You know, there's like a schedule and a deadline and usually a very specific thing that needs to happen in terms of look or feel in a technical way. But when it's my own art, it is an emotional thing. So like it'll be a feeling that I want to achieve. And oftentimes I have no idea how I want to get there. And it is like experimenting as I go. Yeah, and like I was saying, there are some people who say, you know, they paint the world the way that they see it. And that painting I did at the front of the building, I wish when I walked by the TIFF light box, that's how it looked. But I see it the way everyone else does. And I just like, I think I kind of do it the opposite, where I kind of paint the world the way I wish I could see it, as opposed to painting the world the way that I do see it. Yeah, hopefully that helps.
So there's so many different branches of artistic expression, and there's so many different skill trees that you can level up in your artistic career. How do you find like balancing learning new things and exploring with like getting really good at some things?
It's really tough. I think it depends on what you want to be doing. I think for people who are like in a position where they want to use their creativity to like secure a job, like if you're looking for a job in a creative field, then there is kind of like a expectation of like a pretty high skill set requirement for a very specific thing. But I find that it's really easy to settle into a routine with that. Like if you have your one thing that you're really good at, it gets like uncomfortably easy to just keep doing that thing, because not only are you good at it and it becomes easier the better you get at it, but people respond to it better, you know, and there's this like gratification you get from people being excited about the work you're making. I think too much excitement about the work you're making is oftentimes a bad thing, because it forces you to just like get into a routine with that and settle into making the same stuff over and over. So if your question is more about how can you do that for yourself, I think it is about taking chances and failing. Like I was saying, like doing the things that like are the hardest things for you to do and letting yourself do them poorly until either you get better, or you make your peace with not being good at them. And I don't really know anyone honestly who is sort of well-rounded enough to say they're a master of like their entire discipline, right? So many creative fields, especially in my background, having worked in TV and film, require so many different disparate skill sets that it is, I don't want to say impossible, but extremely rare and difficult for someone to excel at all of those things. And the flip side is, yeah, treat yourself to some failure, but then also treat yourself to some successes. Like the reason I set out to make those portrait paintings was just to please myself. Like I said, I paint a lot, so I'm pretty good at it, and it is nice every now and then to just like unwind after a long day by making like a simple, pleasing image that Facebook is going to creep later on, right? So yeah, treat yourself every now and then, but I would say it's more important to challenge yourself with the difficult things, because the things you're good at, those skills are not going to atrophy nearly as quickly. And it's a lot harder to build up, you know, new muscles, new skills, that sort of thing, for your own personal work anyways. Yeah, no problem.
So you mentioned how some faces would get stuck in your subconscious when you were working on your art.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had a similar experience with different artistications from other artists, and whether like that had any influence on your art. And as a follow-up question, I was wondering if when you're working on a personal project, you try to deprive yourself from external media just so that you can like consolidate your artistic voice.
Yeah, so for the first question, for sure, other artist styles are like ingrained in me. I think that like if you were to go through my website and look at the majority of the paintings, and this is something that I don't know that I necessarily set out to do, but there are a lot of these like landscapes or cityscapes with lonely figures in them. And I recently read a biography on Hopper, and that's what all of his paintings are. And I'm a huge fan of Hopper's work. If you look at the aesthetic of my paintings, this really kind of slick, clean digital thing that is very shape driven. There's this painter named Neil Campbell Ross who paints like that, who is a big inspiration for me. He's like a animation visual development guy, and I love his paintings. And I'm never looking at Neil Ross paintings or Hopper paintings when I sit down to make a piece. I'm not like having those open on one side of my computer and I'm making a painting of the front of the light box on the other. But I don't even think it would be a bad thing if I was, right? I think those are like two examples of artists whose work have kind of proliferated into like my creative process. I'm also really inspired by a cartoonist named Paul Pope, who I actually had the opportunity to study under him for a while, and he taught me some really valuable lessons that have kind of stuck with me ever since. And like I mentioned earlier, I think having a mentor is a great thing, right? And some of the ways that Paul approaches his art are ways that I started approaching my art specifically after he was like, I do it this way for this reason. And I was like, that's really cool. I like the way your art feels, the way your art sounds. I wish my art was more like that. And so I kept some of the things that he offered me, that he gave me, that he gifted to me. And other things I left behind. There are other bits of his art that I wouldn't want to see in my own art, but that's the exciting part of distilling that down. And in terms of like exposing or depriving myself to other work, it's like a very like black and white yes and no. I try my best to avoid the work that is the same kind of work that I'm making. I don't remember if I watched any animated shorts while I was making Space Between Stars, but it wouldn't have been a lot. I would have kept myself pretty distanced from that, but I did listen to a ton of music that had a huge influence on the film. I had a very specific playlist of probably about 30 songs that was on loop all day, every day while I was storyboarding the film. I had like 2.5 months of storyboarding the film where the same 30 songs were playing over and over and over, because I felt like it was a great way to get myself in an emotional headspace that was appropriate to the kind of art I was trying to make without putting me in a situation where I was just going to, copy and paste what I was looking at, right? Because there was no way to like translate directly the music I was listening to the story panels that I was drawing, but they emotionally put me exactly where I wanted to be when I sat down at my computer. No problem.
Yeah, I just had a question of, how sometimes different artworks and different artists, they influence like your work and as an artist. But then how do you, while taking these influences to improve your work, how do you still make original work?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that just comes with time and experience and self-reflection. It's a really hard thing to do because I understand the fear of not wanting to copy other artists. I don't want to make artwork that looks derivative of someone else, and I do find that like when I look at my work, if it is feeling too close to someone else's, either intentionally or not, I'll make an active effort to like work outside the box and do what I was saying, where I force myself to fail, right? Like most of my work is done digitally. I really like working on a computer, which is, it's not for everyone. Some people prefer to work traditionally, but if I feel like the work I'm doing is, yeah, it's too derivative of an artist who I clearly have been inspired by, then I'll put myself in a situation where, I'll go sit in a cafe and draw in my sketchbook and use a tool set to make something that like I literally couldn't copy from that person. But it's something that I find happens less and less the more I work. I feel like it's a subconscious thing at this point where I just know what feels good and what feels like me and what is just me looking at someone else's shortcuts and using those shortcuts to get to the finish line quicker. And I don't know how to better describe it than that. But there are times when I see myself doing things where, I guess another example of that is kind of you're forced to do that when you work in animation, right? Like the whole goal of making a TV show on a team is that it looks like everyone is drawing the exact same way, right? So to do that in the day and then go home at night and try and like be yourself is pretty tricky when your job literally you're being paid to copy someone else, right? But because I've done that for so long, it has really set up like an interesting division in my brain where I recognize when I do it, because for my day job, often I am being paid to do exactly the thing that I kind of don't want to be doing at night. So it's a skill just like anything else, right? And I think even though that is how I came around to finding that out, I think it's something you just learn to recognize. It's like your favorite recipes or your favorite foods, right? Like there's a reason why you like the things that you like, even if you can't particularly articulate why or where that came from. And over time, it does get easier to sort through the ingredients and decide I like everything that has cinnamon in it, but I'm not a huge fan of vanilla, right? Instead of just like I like all cookies, just give it time and it'll make sense. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. One of the things that I like to do when I get stuck, not just with art, but with any kind of creative endeavor, is at that point go back to focusing a little bit more on the technical craft aspect of the process. So like usually the things that if I'm getting stuck and I'm getting hung up on, it is like a high level conceptual idea based thing. Like I'm trying to solve a problem that takes a lot of brain power. That is by far the most challenging part for me, is like good idea generation. And I don't know if this is the same for you guys, but in terms of like all the creative endeavors that I'm interested in, good ideas are like the most valuable commodity and the hardest to come by. And so those are the things that I find myself getting hung up on a lot. And if that happens with a piece, the flip side of that is that the technical aspect of creating art, especially as an artist in animation, is that it is like a long and arduous process. There's just a lot of stuff to do, and there is always stuff to do. If I tell myself there is nothing to do other than think of ideas, I am lying to myself, because there is like a whole bunch of homework that I don't want to do that I'm putting off because I'm being an artist, I'm being creative, I'm thinking. But like really, there is like hundreds of drawings to clean up. There's 50 more backgrounds to paint. There is like another sequence of a story to storyboard out. There's just like a large volume of stuff, and so I do that, and it is a much different part of my brain. When I'm doing that kind of work, I can put on an audiobook or a TV show in the background, and you just chill out and get lost in the meditative process of like line mileage, brush mileage, and then yeah, it might take a day or a week, but then all of a sudden those things that I'm getting hung up on, they start to loosen up, right? It's like needing a muscle, and then it opens up and I'm like, okay, I can go back to the idea generation phase. And yeah, whenever I say I have nothing to do, I just tell myself I'm lying, because there's always more and other things to be doing and spending my time on.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I just want to make sure if anyone has a question, please raise your. Oh.
Okay, let's do this. Starting with you.
Sort of how you assert your vision if, say, your collaborators aren't quite aligned.
Yeah, it depends on the type of project. So it really ranges. Part of the reason why I love making comics so much is because I can do whatever I want, and I don't really have to please anyone other than myself, other than an audience, I guess. So there is one person to please this amorphous idea of an audience. And then working on my short film was sort of the next step up from that, where I was on a team, but it was small enough that we were able to like be relatively cohesive. But it was tricky because the core of the film was an idea that was mine, and it was like I was being paid to make this film by a studio, and my job was to follow through on that idea. And there actually was a couple times where I didn't see eye to eye with people, and it was hard to bring them around to getting on board with that. I think that a big part of it though is interpersonal skills. Like being able to connect with someone on a human level. It's really easy to tell someone, you're doing it wrong, you're not good enough, this isn't working out, whatever. But it's kind of like an asshole solution that doesn't actually result in any positive momentum. It's a lot easier to connect with someone on a more fundamental human level and like figure out why it is that you're not on the same page. I think also it's really important to like be open to other people pushing back against your ideas, because a lot of the times other people, even if it is your baby, will have a better solution to the problem, right? And being able to set aside your ego when someone is like, why aren't you doing it this way? Yeah, if you can't set aside your ego and say, why am I doing it that way, at least ask yourself the question, because sometimes those people are right. And that comes back to the excitement of collaborating. I'm thankful that I have a few people in my life who will challenge me on a regular basis, and they make me better. But yeah, then there are times where people have challenged me in the past, and I kind of need to stick to my guns, and it's tough, but it's part of the creative process. And then there's the like extreme opposite end of that spectrum where when I'm working on a TV show, there's networks to answer to, there's advertisers to answer to, there's standards and practices to answer to, there's your director to answer to, there's your creator to answer to. There's a lot of people who, if you were an artist on a project, have kind of like autonomy and authority over you. And if you don't see eye to eye with them, oftentimes you just have to do things that you wouldn't do your own way, right? And it's tough sometimes. Sometimes you just got to swallow it and say, okay, I guess I'll do it your way, and like you be polite about it, and it's fine, like that's the excitement of making your own work, is if you think you can do it better, then there's nothing stopping you from trying and either doing it and proving yourself wrong or proving them wrong, right? But I don't know. Also, when people tell me to do things the way that I kind of don't want to do them, I learned from that. You know, there's like an underlying motivation for everyone's behavior, especially when you're working collaboratively. There is no one who is like on a project who is there with the intent to make it fail, right? Like everyone wants something to succeed. We're all trying to solve the same problem. And so when you're butting heads with someone, I think it's really, really helpful to understand why, as opposed to just like forcefully disagreeing, because everyone has the same goal, which is to make the thing you're working on the best possible version of what it is, right? And if you can get everyone on it and approaching it in that way, as opposed to saying you're doing it wrong or you're doing it wrong, and instead you're kind of like, well, we're all trying to solve the same problem, but we're unable to resolve it because XYZ. Yeah, it's kind of more of a framing issue when you put it that way, right? And it gets people on the same side and opens people up, drops people's guards. And I think that's a good way to, like, when you're in those sort of like middle phase projects, which is like when you're working as an artist, most of your projects, you know, where there's kind of like a shared level of authority or responsibility where you have to collaborate, a really good way to like reframe things so that people aren't getting their back up and it is not a me versus you, it's us versus this bigger thing. And how do we resolve it?
Since work in animation requires such versatility and style and approach, do you know any artists who don't have a style anymore?
Oh, God, I think it's in there's that Richard Williams book. There's a story, I think it's in that book, The Animator's Survival Kit or something like that, of some animator who worked on Roger Rabbit and then literally could not draw anything else after working on Who Framed Roger Rabbit other than that exact same style and never worked again. And I don't know if there's any truth to that, but that is one of those like animation legends that I've heard passed down through the years. So I don't know if there's truth to it, but what I do know is that there were a lot of people who, again, and I keep making animation references. I know there are some animation people in here. For those of you who are not animation people, bear with me, I guess. But when there was like a big switch from traditional media to digital, you know, when everything became made on computers and we left paper and pencil behind, there were a lot of people who got lost. They were just unwilling to like try and learn what that is. And I think that is something that'll continue to happen. I don't know where or how it'll be, but there'll just be like, you know, paradigm shifts in the industry where, you know, you need to learn to adapt whether you want to or not. And if you don't want to, it's fine. But then you also have to just like accept the fact that there might not be a job for you 10 years down the road if you're not willing to adapt in whatever form the industry is asking of you. But again, that's like a very commercially driven thing. I'm sure those guys who refuse to give up pencil and paper are probably still happily drawing and could be successful in other areas making other art. But in terms of just like lining up job after job and contract after contract, you kind of have to be willing to like, yeah, accept those things. And in terms of just getting stuck in a style, yeah, I don't know. Maybe there are some people who want that, right? Like maybe there are people who once they get to a certain point, they just want to settle. I think that's another sort of like common misconception from the outside looking in at artists who have a really particular voice. I think if you were to ask them, they probably wouldn't think about it the way that you do from the outside. I was listening to an interview with Robert Valley recently, who is like an amazing animation character designer, one of my favorite artists. And the person who's interviewing him asked him about his style because he's like renowned for the look of his art. And he was like, "Where did you get this?" And he was just like, "Oh, I'm just doing my best Jamie Hewlett impersonation, who is like the creator of Tank Girl," right? And so like for anyone else looking at Robert Valley, you're like, "Oh my God, how do you do that?" And he's just like, "Oh, I'm just copying Jamie Hewlett, who's cooler than me," you know? So it's like from the inside, it's always a little bit different than it is from the outside.
How quick is your question?
Good question. I can shorten it. So I'm interested in how you use depth of field in your work.
Okay.
How the foreground, more often than not, feels like a platform to kind of invite the audience to view what you've drawn or worked on, if not a literal platform like the subway platform.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, when you're working on your work, and I'm working on editing short film, and the common saying is to visualize you're the theater and you're part of the audience looking at your work, I'm wondering, do you consider the perspective of the audience? Do you put yourself in their shoes, or do you put them into your work?
I will try and quickly answer with two different answers to that. In terms of how I compose the image, something that I'm always thinking about, something that a teacher told me that stuck with me a very long time ago, is that I always want the images I'm making to feel like they extend beyond the screen or the canvas. So like every painting or composition I'm making, I want it to feel like that thing continues to live outside of the picture plane. So oftentimes, like, I'll be casting shadows or lights or having things move in and out of a frame in a way that implies whatever we're seeing is a small section of a much bigger living thing. And then in terms of like how the audience is going to see it, I definitely do that. When I was working on Space Between Stars, so much of that film is about scale. It's like about these tiny, tiny little creatures in this giant derelict environment. And I ended up actually like going to a friend's house and projecting my concept paintings and storyboards through his projector on a giant wall to get a sense of that scale, to see how the audience would interpret it, because I was nervous what I was seeing on a computer monitor wouldn't give the audience the experience that I wanted. And I had ended up making a ton of notes and scaling things way down to almost the point where I couldn't even see them on a computer screen, but that was based off of how they looked in the way that I knew they would look in a theater. And it helped a lot in terms of like, yeah, getting it to a point where I was confident in the audience internalizing it the way that I wanted them to. Yeah, no problem.
That's a great technical question. I'm glad we asked it. I just want to thank you all for coming, and thank you very much to Sam Bradley, for hanging out with us before his other event today.
Yeah, I hope some of you guys come and watch the movie tonight. Thank you.